I was asked to talk at this online conference by Steffi, who I've had some interesting and productive conversations with in the past. I am Merlyn, one of the founding members of Children of Artemis, and still involved and still active. I'm also the creator of the Witchfest concept, the event that many of you may have heard of, but the whole point behind the original name was to reclaim the word witch. The events at the time were avoiding any negative words they felt, and witch was one of them. They actually avoided using it in any advertising, names of events, etc. And I thought, beginning of the new millennia, it was time to change. It did hit some opposition, including from local councils in Croydon, Glasgow, Sutton, and various other places. All of those were opposed and successfully overturned, and all the events went ahead. It really did change things. Nowadays, you can start something like Pagan Pride, and the local council will not bat an eyelid. It changed life forever, for the better. Still work to be done. There are still people who are extremists and will oppose anything they don't agree with. But that's to be expected. What can you do about that? Not very much. A little bit about myself. I'm an Alexandrian Gardnerian Wiccan, but that does not colour the composition of Children of Artemis or Witchfest. They're both open to all pagan paths and anyone with an open mind. That has been from the beginning and is to today. Now a little bit about this event. I was asked to do a talk for the Scottish PF conference that sadly had to be cancelled due to the crisis. And this is my first time in the SPF Edinburgh conference. So I'm now doing that talk online. SPF and Children of Artemis have a close relationship now, and we are working together for the benefit of all pagans in Scotland. We are even looking at cooperating in bringing back Witchfest to Scotland. It was last held in 2008, and we'd dearly love to bring it back. We love Scotland, and we'd love the event to happen again. So that is on the agenda. Watch this space. It might just happen sometime in the next couple of years. Very honoured to speak here, and hope you enjoy the talk. Okay, my talk today is on the misconceptions of Wicca and paganism in general, including specific paths. And there are several misconceptions. I mean, you get the obvious ones from external general public, of devil worship, etc., yada yada. And anyone watching this will know that this is a long way from the truth for Wicca. It has nothing to do with the Bible, or God, or indeed the devil. That's a Christian concept, as is hell. So no, we're not worried about going to hell. We don't believe it exists. It's all good for us. But within the pagan community, there are misconceptions, which are more important to address. And the first, which I have heard many, many times, is regarding the threefold law and the Wiccan Rede. You will get people who claim to be witches but not Wiccan because they don't agree with the Wiccan Rede, which is kind of fair enough, because they consider that they want to be free to act in the case of a direct threat, and they feel that the Wiccan Rede would prohibit them. Likewise with the threefold law, it acts as a extra incentive, if you like, to obey the Wiccan Rede. It's almost like they were written together. They probably were. It was probably Gerald's fault. But this is all a misconception. The popular opinion among many non-Wiccans is that Wicca is essentially pacifist, and that the Wiccan Rede and the threefold law taken together mean that Wiccans never curse, never defend their own using magic, and are prohibited from using negative magic. This is not strictly true. So those that say, oh, I'm a witch because, not Wiccan because I don't want to be prohibited by the Wiccan Rede, are under a illusion that it's a law. I mean, it is unfortunate in the case of the threefold law that it actually says law in the name. They're guidelines, and they're aspirational. If you're Wiccan, you want to aspire to the Wiccan Rede. Obviously, it's good to do right by people. You want to do positive things. You want to help people rather than curse them all the time. It's generally not only good for them, it's good for you. As the threefold law kind of states in a very hard way, karma is a more general concept, and the threefold law is no different. If you act in a negative way to everyone else, they're going to tend to act in a negative way to you. It's just the way of the world. It's not saying that if you throw some curse at them, you're going to get 3 thrown back at you. It doesn't work that way. It does mean that you're not immune from the response of the universe. Any action has a reaction, and you have to take that into account. The Wiccan Rede is a guideline. It's something to live up to, something to consider when you're considering any magic. And useful whether you're Wiccan or not. I'm not saying you should treat it as a law, but as a guideline, it's a fairly good principle to live by. The threefold law says if you do something, there will be impact. It could possibly be big. That's pretty true. Even in your regular life, if you don't bother looking each way when you cross the road, there could be impact. It could be quite big. So it's worth considering the guidelines before you take action. Wicker encourages that. So it encourages thoughtful action. It does not encourage passivism. So if you and your own are threatened and you're Wiccan, will you use any means necessary to answer that challenge? Absolutely. The difference is that because of the Wiccan Rede and the threefold law, you will consider quite carefully how you do it. Far from being pacifists, Wiccans can be some of the meanest son of a bitches you've ever met on the planet, because they think really, really hard about how they will counter something that is completely out of order and requires a response. But they're not going to do that at the drop of a hat. So Wiccans should not be considering drastic action for a slight insult, or someone blanks them when they thought they shouldn't have been. This is for serious stuff. This is for the kind of stuff where it's self-defense. So, Wiccans, pacifists, no. A Wiccan read a good aspiration? Yes. For anyone, Wiccan or not. It's not a bad aspiration to live up to. Yet another. Wicca has a specific god and goddess, all-encompassing. A god that basically contains all the others, and a goddess that is the sum of all goddesses. So they don't have the opportunity to worship their own individual gods and goddesses. No, not true. If you go to a Wiccan open ceremony, you will quite often see people in the UK, certainly, saying god and goddess instead of any particular god name, or they might use something generic that everyone will know. Gaia, possibly. Pan, Hern, whatever. They may use just god and goddess. In the States, they use lord and lady a lot. Now, this is basically because the individual or group concerned want to keep their personal worship private. It does not mean that they're not polytheistic and have the potential to worship their own gods and goddesses, even ones that are not mentioned by Gerald Gardner, for example, or Alexander's. So there are Wiccan groups that are dedicated to gods in the Norse, Germanic, Celtic, Italian, Greek, Roman, you name it. And some have got, Egyptian, mustn't forget them. I'm sure there are some that have got even more exotic, or whether it's Aztec or Chinese or Japanese. There are groups for everything. And it's down to the individual group, the tradition, and the individual as to their choice of deity. The Book of Shadows. Right, there are two myths about the Book of Shadows. The first, which is kind of put out because of the original secrecy, is that it's effectively making Wicca a religion of the book, a bit like Christianity. Now, yes, there is, among many traditions, a book handed down, which is traditionally copied by hand. Not always these days. I mean, we have moved on from quill pens. But that was the tradition. But you were encouraged, even with that, to make your own alterations, your own additions, and then if you in turn passed it on, those additions and changes would go with it. It's not set in stone. It evolves with life. Life changes. Life now, 70 years on, is very different to the 50s. Things change. And the Book of Shadows changes with Wicca. It's a very agile and very modern thinking belief system. It does adapt, even with that traditional type of Book of Shadows. The other myth is it's just effectively your own personal diary. Now, for some solitary Wiccans who don't have the benefit of having a Book of Shadows handed to them, it is, because they're creating it all from scratch for the very first time. There's no one to hand them a handmade, ready-made Book of Shadows. They've literally got to start at page 1 and write it themselves. That's hard. Not something to be dismissed as not important. It's a really hard thing to do. And a lot of solitaries have created quite amazing Books of Shadows with some incredible stuff in them. And they've basically compiled it and written it all themselves. An incredible feat. So it does depend on how you operate in Wicca as to what the Book of Shadows is. But whatever it is, it's not set in stone. It's not the word of God. It is not the Witch's Bible. Nicking a phrase from the Pharaohs. Tools. When you start in Wicca, you need a lot of them. And we recommend you go to proper handmade, and no, you don't. You don't need anything. You might like to have a nicer censer for your incense. You might like to have nicer candlesticks in the shape of various gods and goddesses or mythical creatures. You might like a nicer athame, or you might like one of those crystal wands they make in Glastonbury. You do not need any of them. You might want them as desirable and pretty items. You don't need them. They're not necessary for ritual. They're not necessary for working magic. They're not necessary for being a Wiccan. You can buy, for your athame, you can use any knife that you so choose. If you are, obviously you want to choose something that appeals to you, that has never cut anything, particularly never injured any person or animal, and you want it to be something that you feel attached to. But it doesn't have to be extraordinarily beautiful. It doesn't have to have pentagrams inscribed on it in silver. It does not have to cost £300. You could buy it in a hardware store and think, that's a really nice looking knife. Just make sure it's not razor sharp, or get a friend to blunt it if you haven't got the skill, because otherwise it could be a bit of a liability, even if you're solitary. So fancy tools, nice maybe for some, needed, not in the slightest. So we've mentioned solitary a bit before. Solitary Wicca arrives. Are solitary Wiccans real Wiccans? Have they replaced traditional? What's the deal? Who's a Wiccan and who's not? It used to be simple back in the early days. You were either initiated into the established line or you weren't. Simple as that. That is no longer true. And I'm rather glad it's not. Although I am initiated into a traditional line, having the ability to work as a solitary is a lot more flexible. And actually, it's not that different. Historically, Wiccans from covens have always worked as solitaries. they haven't always been able to go to a coven meeting, and they haven't always been able to get the whole coven behind whatever they're doing. So they've always done works in a solitary fashion. But when you get someone who hasn't gone through that initiation process doing the same thing, suddenly everyone screams foul. Fortunately, that period is past. Solitary Wicca is here and growing. There are now far more solitary Wiccans than there are traditional, and it shows no sign of slowing down. The boat's sailed, it's arrived, and people have to get used to it. And the reality is, solitary Wicca is actually a pretty good recruiting ground for traditional Wiccan groups, which leads me neatly in to the next myth. Traditional Wicca is declining. There are so many alternatives now. You can become any kind of witch now. You can become a hedge witch. You can become a Satanist witch. You can become almost any flavour of witch. Green witch. Call it what. There are more varieties than you can shake a stick at. And with all this variety and all these new versions, and increasingly people are turning to solitary because it's easy. You don't need to be accepted into anything. You don't need to do any training. You pick up a book and you go. The reality is different. Traditional groups are growing. The number of people looking for a coven place is increasing. The reality has been that solitary Wicca has not been a bad thing for the traditional coven-based system. It's actually been an incredibly good thing, and continues to be. And it does give people a real choice. If you want to be Wiccan, but you have there are no Wiccan groups near you, you don't know anyone, or your personal circumstance means that joining a group and committing to meetings even at once a month is just not a viable prospect, solitary Wicca is a pretty good bet. Why not? The two now live together a lot more amicably. You still get some of the kind of hard guard traditionals who will go, no, they're not really real Wiccans, and it will still kick off. But fortunately, a minority. So, next, Wicca's ceremonial. It's not like kind of down with the hedge witch vibe. It doesn't use natural magic. It's much more almost high magic. Well, true, it could be. Wicca can adapt and can steal from other traditions if it's something that's worth taking. And has the concept of chakras, for example, taken from the Hindus, is now common in a lot of Wiccan groups. There are many things that Wicca has gone, yeah, that's a pretty good idea. We'll have that. Integrate it in, and everything carries on like before. So, while it can be ceremonial, and particularly some Alexandrian groups are extremely good at ceremony, and very accomplished at ritual, it doesn't mean it has to be. And in fact, can be very, very natural and simplistic. The rituals can be as simple as a simple blessing in a few words, chosen by yourself, and lighting a candle. Done. it does not have to be an elaborate several-page ceremony with loads of stuff happening. So while it can be ceremonial, Wicca is adaptable and can also be quite earthy. Now, dress code. Unfortunately, I am wearing black, so this doesn't kind of work. But there is a perception that to be Wiccan, you have to conform to the dress code. And I've got on my notes, paint it black. And it's true, a lot of Wiccans do wear black. Not all. Some will wear the brightest colours you've ever seen, and you need sunglasses to look at them. True, some will wear a business suit, some will wear a floral dress, or a Hawaiian shirt. They wear whatever they're comfortable in. Personally, I come from a music background with rock music, and I wore black before I was Wiccan. It didn't change anything. I just carried on the way I was. So you don't have to look like a rocker or a goth to be Wiccan. You can wear as bright colours as people around you can stand. Possibly don't go too far. Fluorescent is possibly pushing it, but yeah, if you've got a lot of Wiccan friends who love the fluorescent stuff, go for it. Spells. Now, there is a lot of myths around spells and magic. And when you think about it, spells have actually a lot in common with prayers of other religions. It's an attempt by spiritual means to change reality for yourself or someone around you. And actually, when you look at a prayer, the same could be said of that. So, can you write a spell yourself? Absolutely. You do not have to get one out of a book or find it handed down all the way from Doreen Valiente or Gerald Gardner. The best spells are actually the ones you write yourself, because they're targeted to exactly the problem at hand. So they're perfect for the situation you're in. So far from being not quite as good as one you've found in a book that's 50 years old or more, your own spell's actually better. It's key to your situation. And if you're no poet, it doesn't have to rhyme. It might be easier to remember if it does, which is why so many do, but it doesn't have to rhyme. So if you want to write your own spell, go for it. It will be better than anything you can get from anyone else. Now, there are public perceptions and issues regarding not only Wicca, but all pagan paths. And paganism as a whole does have some negative connotations in other communities. For example, in some Christian communities, to be referred to as pagan simply means you don't believe in God and the Bible. Effectively, you're a faithless person, which is far from what most pagans believe. They're deeply religious in many cases, not to the deity that the Christians or the Muslims might worship, but they are deeply religious in their own way. So it does not imply, if you're a pagan, that you have no respect for deity. You may have deep respect for deity. You may be a firm follower of Odin, Freya, Apollo, Zeus, Pan. The list goes on and on. The prospects are endless. So paganism is seen as kind of almost inverse anti-Christianity by some. And it's just so not. It's just not particularly related. Where Wicca and paganism, modern paganism, are actually, when you look at them, although they have ancient roots, they're a relatively modern phenomena. But they hark back to times before the major monotheistic religions. They tap into a different stream. They're not anti, they're not in any way opposed, they're just purely different. Wicca and witches. If you get asked onto a television interview about Wicca or witchcraft, one of the questions that will always come up is about sex, orgies, nudity, dancing around a fire in the middle of a forest naked. And do Wiccans do this? And the answer is, some might, but you get people who are not Wiccan or pagan in any shape or form who also dance around in the middle of a forest naked, if they so wish. And some Wiccans would never dream of it, particularly in climates like the UK. They will say, well, it's much too cold here for that. I'm going to keep my coat and cloak, thanks very much. So it's horses for courses. And no, it's not a path that is suitable for those that are interested in purely the sexual perception. That is rapidly explained to new people who think it is, because they're coming to the wrong place. They probably should try a swingers club. That would be much more of their for their interests. Heathens. The heathens, Norse, Germanics. Unfortunately, in the recent past, during the 30s and 40s, their beliefs, their gods, goddesses, and their symbols were misappropriated by fascists quite deliberately. People like Goebbels and Hitler quite systematically misappropriated heathen symbols from the SS insignia as runes through to the desecration of Echsenstein in Germany, which is a beautiful Germanic monument carved into a natural rock formation, was like scattered with swastikas and Nazi symbols. Cultural misappropriation by the Nazis does not make heathens or people who believe in the Norse or Germanic religions fascists. Far from it. But it does mean that some people have that perception externally, and you do have that ongoing issue. But at all of the events that I help organise, we always try and have a heathen contingent. And we are very active in helping those good heathens combat this misperception. Heathens are not associated with that. And the Norse and Germanic beliefs have nothing to do with right-wing politics. Druids. The title of Ronald Hutton's book, Blood and Mistletoe, kind of gives you an impression of where I'm going here. The kind of image of the white-robed druid with the silver sickle and the poor innocent sacrifice victim is something that historical druids may or may not have done. It's very hard to tell, and there is no conclusive proof that anything like that was associated with the druids. But the perception is there. You also have their unfortunate link to the 19th century and early 20th century kind of upper class nobility parading around in druids' uniforms as a kind of ceremonial club. There was no religious aspect to it. It was just everyone from the Prince of Wales down became a ceremonial druid. Pagan druidry is nothing like that. And the image of the bloodthirsty druid with the sickle is nothing to do with modern pagan druidry. They're just as peaceful as any other pagan, and I don't know any pagan druids with a noble title. So I know quite a few druids, so druids are okay. So all of us have to suffer with misconceptions about our chosen paths. And there are many, many more that I'm sure I haven't had time to include, and some that I just purely won't have even heard of. But it's important to counter them. And it's important to remember that as a pagan community, we are stronger together than we are apart. Unity is important, and we should focus on our similarities and the points we agree on, and cooperate and support each other, rather than focusing on differences and divisions and opposing each other. There's too few of us for that. We are growing, but we're still, if you take all of us, we're still a minority. And we need that community to be healthy, strong, and not have misconceptions and divides that are actually based on myth. Or everything I've said, all those misconceptions are all modern myths. They're not true. They're simply not. So, I hope you enjoyed the talk and you enjoy the rest of the talks in the series, and hope next year that I'll be able to meet you all at a real event rather than an online one. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.